The wooden gavel fell with a sound that echoed through the courthouse like thunder, and in that moment, everything changed. Not just for the 5 children standing on the auction block with hollow eyes and threadbare clothes, but for the man in the back row who had come to buy cattle and instead found himself bidding on something far more precious. What happened next in the dusty hills of Montana would challenge everything society believed about family, success, and the true meaning of prosperity. This is the story of how one desperate decision created a legacy that still inspires the world. Today, before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 15th, 1889, dawned gray and bitter across the Montana Territory, with storm clouds gathering over the Bitterroot Valley like a shroud of impending doom. Samuel Harrison stood at the edge of his property, watching the last of his cattle being driven away by the bank's representatives, their hoofbeats raising dust clouds that seemed to mirror the emptiness settling in his chest. At 34 years old, with hands scarred by barbed wire and a back bent from years of hard labor, Sam had built something from nothing only to watch it crumble beneath forces beyond his control. The Harrison Ranch had once sprawled across 800 acres of prime grazing land, where clear mountain streams fed emerald pastures and the peaks of the Sapphire Mountains provided a backdrop so magnificent it could steal a man's breath. Sam's father, Thomas Harrison, had claimed this land during the territorial rush of 1864, building their log cabin with his own hands and establishing a herd that had grown to nearly 300 head of prime Montana beef. For 25 years, the Harrison family had been synonymous with success in Bitter Creek Valley, their brand respected from Helena to Missoula. But prosperity, Sam had learned, was as fragile as morning frost on autumn grass. The winter of 1887 had been brutal beyond imagination, with temperatures dropping to 40 below zero and snowdrifts that buried entire buildings. The locals called it the Winter of Blue Snow, and it had devastated ranching operations across the territory. Sam had lost 2/3 of his herd, watching helplessly as cattle froze to death in the fields, their carcasses creating the grim landscape that haunted his dreams months later. The financial blow had been staggering, but Sam might have recovered from natural disaster. What broke him was human greed dressed up as progress. The Montana Central Railroad had decided to route their new line directly through the heart of his property, claiming eminent domain and offering compensation that wouldn't cover half the land's true value. When Sam had fought the decision in court, the legal fees had consumed what little savings remained from his diminished cattle sales. Now, standing in the pre-dawn darkness, Sam watched his life's work disappear into the distance. The bank had foreclosed 3 days ago, giving him until the end of the month to vacate the property his family had called home for 25 years. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very railroad that had destroyed his ranch would soon carry passengers through what had once been his land. Travelers gazing out windows at scenery his father had fought Indians to claim and his own blood. And sweat had improved. Sam's hands trembled as he rolled a cigarette from the last of his tobacco, the paper crackling in the cold air. He had exactly $47 to his name, a broken-down wagon, 2 horses that should have been put out to pasture years ago, and nowhere to go. At 34, he was starting over with less than he'd had at 14, when his father first put a branding iron in his hands and taught him that a man's worth was measured by his willingness to work until his body begged for mercy. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted his brooding. Sam turned to see his neighbor, Marcus Webb, riding up the rutted path that led to the ranch house. Webb owned the spread adjacent to Sam's land, or what had been Sam's land until 3 days ago. Unlike Sam, Webb had diversified his holdings, investing in the railroad stocks that had ultimately destroyed his neighbor's livelihood. "Morning, Sam," Webb called out, dismounting with the careful movements of a man whose prosperity had given him the luxury of avoiding physical labor. Heard about the foreclosure. Came to see if there's anything I can do. Sam studied his neighbor's face, searching for signs of genuine sympathy behind the careful concern. Webb was a decent man, as far as Sam knew, but he was also a practical businessman who understood that one man's misfortune often created opportunities for those positioned to take advantage of them. "Appreciate the thought, Marcus," Sam replied, his voice hoarse from the cold air and lack of sleep. "But unless you've got a miracle in your saddlebags, I reckon there's not much anyone can do at this point." Webb shifted uncomfortably, his gaze moving across the empty corrals and silent buildings that had once buzzed with activity. "Actually, Sam, I might have something. Not a miracle, exactly, but maybe a chance to start fresh somewhere else." Sam raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. Despite his exhaustion, in his experience, when prosperous men offered opportunities to desperate ones, the terms usually favored the prosperous. But with $47 and a foreclosure notice, he wasn't in a position to be choosy about his options. "I'm listening," Sam said, crushing his cigarette under his boot heel. Webb reached into his coat and withdrew a folded newspaper, its pages yellowed and worn from handling. "There's a livestock auction in Great Falls next week. Not just cattle and horses, though. They're selling children, Sam. Orphans from back east whose families died in that cholera outbreak in Chicago." Sam stared at his neighbor, certain he had misheard. "Children? What in hell are you talking about, Marcus?" "It's legal," Webb said quickly, unfolding the newspaper to reveal a printed advertisement bordered in black. "The Orphan Train Initiative. Started by some charitable organization in New York. They gather up children who have no families, no prospects, and transport them west to be placed with families who can provide for them. The adoption fees help cover transportation costs and legal paperwork." Sam read the advertisement with growing disbelief. The Illinois Children's Aid Society was indeed offering to place orphaned children with suitable Western families for fees ranging from $50 to $200, depending on the child's age and circumstances. The ad emphasized the children's work ethic, their gratitude for any opportunity to contribute to a family, and their desperate need for homes where they could grow into productive citizens under proper guidance. "This is insane," Sam muttered, reading the fine print that described the children's backgrounds. "These aren't cattle, Marcus, they're human beings." "Human beings who need homes," Webb replied, his tone growing more urgent. "Sam, think about it. You've got ranching skills that could support a family, but you need hands to help rebuild. These children need families who can teach them trades, give them purpose. It could work for everyone involved." Sam handed the newspaper back, shaking his head. "I can't even feed myself right now, much less a bunch of kids. Besides, what do I know about raising children? I've been a bachelor my whole life, focused on nothing but cattle and land." "The land is gone," Webb said bluntly. "The cattle are gone. But your knowledge, your work ethic, your ability to build something from nothing, that's still here." He tapped his temple. "There's opportunity in Colorado, Sam. Cheap land for men willing to work it. The railroad expansion is creating new towns, new markets. A man with children to help him could establish something substantial." Sam walked toward the ranch house, his mind reeling from the conversation. The building that had sheltered 3 generations of Harrisons looked smaller. In the gray morning light, its logs weathered and chinked with mud that needed constant maintenance. The roof leaked in 2 places, the foundation had settled unevenly, and the whole structure bore the scars of decades spent battling Montana's harsh climate. Inside, the house felt even more desolate. His mother's furniture had been sold to pay legal fees, leaving only a table, 2 chairs, and the iron bed frame his father had hauled from St. Louis 25 years ago. The kitchen held nothing but a few tin plates, a coffee pot with a dented side, and the cast-iron skillet his mother had used to feed harvest crews during the ranch's prosperous years. Webb followed him inside, his boots echoing hollowly on the bare wooden floors. "Sam, I know this sounds desperate, but maybe desperate is what you need right now. These children aren't looking for luxury. They're looking for someone who won't abandon them, someone who'll teach them how to work and survive. That's exactly what you can offer." Sam poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been sitting on the stove since the previous evening. The liquid was bitter and cold, but it gave him something to do with his hands while he processed Webb's suggestion. The idea of purchasing children struck him as fundamentally wrong, even if the legal framework suggested otherwise. "What kind of children are we talking about?" Sam asked, surprising himself with the question. Webb consulted the newspaper again. "Says here they range in age from 5 to 16. Most of them have been living on the streets since their families died. They've been taught basic reading and arithmetic by the Aid Society, but mainly they know how to work. Factory work, mostly, but the ad emphasizes their adaptability." Sam tried to imagine 5 or 6 children living in his Spartan cabin, sharing meals around his rickety table, learning to rope cattle and mend fences. The mental picture was so foreign to his experience that he couldn't make it seem real. He had spent his adult life in the company of ranch hands and cattle, where conversation centered on weather, market prices, and the practical challenges of managing livestock across difficult terrain. "How much?" Sam asked, though he wasn't sure why he was pursuing the conversation. "Depends on the child," Webb replied. "Older boys cost more because they can do more work immediately. Girls are cheaper because—" He trailed off, apparently recognizing the uncomfortable implications of his words. "Because society values them less," Sam finished grimly. "Jesus, Marcus, listen to what we're talking about. We're discussing the purchase price of human beings like they're breeding stock." "Sam," Webb said, his voice taking on the tone of a man trying to close a business deal, "those children are going to be sold whether you participate or not. The question is whether they'll go to someone who sees them as an investment in free labor, or to someone who might actually care about their welfare." The argument carried an uncomfortable logic that Sam couldn't easily dismiss. If the system existed, if children were indeed being transported west and placed with families through financial transactions, then perhaps the quality of those families mattered more than the moral ambiguity of the process itself. "I don't have enough money," Sam said, though even as he spoke, he was calculating possibilities. $47 won't buy one child, much less several. Webb smiled for the first time since arriving, reaching into his coat to withdraw a leather envelope. "That's where I come in, Sam. I'm prepared to loan you $300, enough to purchase 4 or 5 children, and have money left over for supplies and travel expenses." "At what interest rate?" Sam asked suspiciously. In his experience, generosity from prosperous neighbors usually came with strings attached. "No interest," Webb replied. "But I want something else in return. I want you to take those children to Colorado and establish a ranch that specializes in training other orphan children in agricultural skills. Create a place where children from back east can learn trades that will serve them throughout their lives." Sam stared at his neighbor, beginning to understand the broader scope of what was being proposed. "You're talking about some kind of school." "I'm talking about an opportunity to do something meaningful with your life while solving your immediate financial problems," Webb corrected. "The government is offering land grants to anyone willing to establish educational or charitable institutions in developing territories. You could claim a substantial homestead in Colorado and receive ongoing support for operating an agricultural training program." The conversation had moved far beyond Sam's desperate need for immediate survival into territory that seemed both terrifying and impossibly ambitious. He had never considered himself an educator or a visionary, just a practical man who understood cattle and land management. The idea of becoming responsible for multiple children's futures felt overwhelming. "Why me?" Sam asked. Why not do this yourself if you think it's such a good opportunity? Webb's expression grew serious. Because I'm comfortable, Sam. Comfortable men don't take the kinds of risks that create something extraordinary. You've got nothing left to lose and everything to prove. That's exactly the combination needed for something like this to work. Sam walked to the window and looked out at the empty corrals where his cattle had spent their last night on Harrison land. The silence outside was profound, broken only by the wind moving through the bare branches of the cottonwood trees his father had planted near the creek. For 25 years, this place had been filled with the sounds of life: cattle lowing, horses nickering, ranch hands calling to each other across the yard. "What makes you think I wouldn't just take your money and disappear?" Sam asked. "Because I know you," Webb replied simply. "You're Thomas Harrison's son. Your word means something, even when you've lost everything else." The reference to his father hit Sam harder than he expected. Thomas Harrison had built his reputation on integrity, keeping his promises even when it cost him money he couldn't afford to lose. Sam had spent his entire adult life trying to live up to that standard, and even facing financial ruin, he couldn't imagine abandoning it now. "If I did this insane thing," Sam said slowly, "if I actually went to this auction and bought children, like they were livestock, what guarantee would they have that I wouldn't just work them to death on some godforsaken homestead?" "The same guarantee any child has," Webb replied. "The character of the man raising them." The weight of that responsibility settled on Sam's shoulders like a heavy yoke. He had spent his life responsible only for himself and his cattle, making decisions that affected no one's future but his own. The idea of holding multiple young lives in his hands, of shaping their development through his choices and failures, seemed impossibly daunting. But as the morning light grew stronger and the reality of his situation became clearer, Sam began to see the terrible logic in Webb's proposal. He had lost everything he had spent his life building, but he still possessed knowledge and skills that could create value. Children needed homes and training. He needed help and purpose. The transaction might be morally complex, but the potential outcomes could benefit everyone involved. "I need to think about this," Sam said finally. Webb nodded and headed toward the door. "The auction is in 6 days. If you decide to go, I'll have the money ready." He paused at the threshold. "Sam, sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as impossible situations. Don't let pride keep you from seeing what this could become." After Webb left, Sam stood alone in his empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of his family's history and the echoes of his own shattered dreams. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of another brutal Montana winter. For the first time since the foreclosure, Sam began to imagine a different future. Not the comfortable continuation of his family's legacy, but something entirely new and unpredictable. 5 orphan children who needed everything he could offer, and a chance to build something unprecedented in the developing territories of the American West. The idea terrified him. It also filled him with a strange excitement he hadn't felt in years. 6 days to make a decision that would change everything. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The 6 days that followed Webb's visit passed like a fever dream, filled with sleepless nights and conversations with ghosts. Sam found himself talking to his father's spirit in the empty barn, asking Thomas Harrison what he would do if faced with such an impossible choice. The wind through the rafters seemed to whisper answers, but they came in riddles Sam couldn't quite decipher. On the 3rd day, Sam rode into Bitter Creek to settle his final accounts and say goodbye to the few people who had known him since childhood. The town had never been large, maybe 300 souls on its busiest day, but it had served as the social and commercial center for ranchers scattered across the valley. Now walking down the dusty main street with Webb's loan burning like a brand in his pocket, Sam felt like a stranger revisiting someone else's memories. Martha Caldwell, who ran the general store with her husband Henry, looked up from her ledger when the bell above the door announced Sam's arrival. Her expression immediately softened with the sympathy reserved for neighbors facing hard times. Martha had known Sam since he was 12 years old, when his mother would bring him to town for supplies and church socials. "Samuel Harrison," she said, rising from behind the counter with the careful movements of a woman whose joints had begun to protest a lifetime of hard work. "I heard about the ranch. I'm so sorry, dear. Your parents would be heartbroken to see." "What's happened?" Sam removed his hat, running weathered fingers through hair that had gone prematurely gray during the stressful months of fighting the railroad's legal machine. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. I came to settle my account and pick up a few things for travel." Martha consulted her ledger, though Sam suspected she already knew the figures by heart. The Caldwells had extended credit to struggling ranchers throughout the valley, understanding that Montana's harsh conditions required neighbors to support each other through difficult seasons. "You owe $18.43, she said quietly. "But Henry and I have been talking, and we're prepared to forgive the debt if you're truly leaving the valley." The offer of forgiveness stung more than any demand for payment could have. Sam had spent his adult life paying his debts promptly, taking pride in the Harrison family's reputation for financial integrity. Accepting charity felt like acknowledging that his father's legacy had died with the foreclosure. "I appreciate the kindness, Mrs. Caldwell, but I'll pay what I owe," Sam replied, counting out bills from Webb's loan. The Harrison name still means something, even if the ranch is gone. Martha accepted the money with understanding, recognizing the pride that drove Sam's insistence on settling his accounts. She had seen many men broken by financial disaster, and she could distinguish between those who might recover their footing and those who would never rise again. Sam Harrison, despite his current circumstances, still carried himself like a man who believed in his own ability to rebuild. "What will you do now?" she asked, beginning to gather supplies Sam had requested: dried beans, flour, coffee, salt pork, and ammunition for his rifle. "I'm going to Colorado," Sam said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Going to try ranching again on cheaper land." Martha nodded, but her expression suggested she sensed there was more to the story. "Colorado's wild country, from what I hear. Beautiful, but hard on folks who aren't prepared for it. You'll be careful, won't you?" "Yes, ma'am," Sam replied, touched by her maternal concern. "I've learned a few things about surviving hard country." As Martha wrapped his purchases, Sam found himself studying the store's familiar contents with the bittersweet attention of someone memorizing details he would never see again. The shelves lined with patent medicines and dry goods, the display case filled with penny candy that had tempted him as a child, the pot-bellied stove where old-timers gathered to argue politics and weather. All of it would continue existing without him, serving other customers, hosting other conversations. "Samuel," Martha said softly, leaning across the counter with the conspiratorial air of someone sharing important intelligence. "I don't know what your plans are, exactly, but I want you to have something." She reached under the counter and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age but still serviceable. "This belonged to my father when he first came west. He kept records of everything: weather patterns, crop yields, which suppliers were honest, which neighbors could be trusted. Information that helped him survive when he didn't know what he was doing." Sam accepted the journal with reverence, understanding the value of accumulated wisdom in unfamiliar territory. "Mrs. Caldwell, I can't take this. It must have sentimental value." "It has practical value," she corrected firmly. "And practical value should go to someone who can use it. My father always said that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied. Start writing down what you learn in Colorado, and maybe someday you'll be able to help someone else who's starting over." The gift touched Sam more deeply than Martha's offered debt forgiveness. It represented confidence in his ability to not merely survive in Colorado, but to learn and grow and eventually have wisdom worth sharing. For the first time since the foreclosure, someone was treating him like a man with a future rather than a victim of circumstances. Sam's next stop was the Bitter Creek Church, where Reverend David Morrison had presided over the spiritual lives of Valley residents for 15 years. Morrison was a pragmatic man who understood that frontier religion needed to address earthly concerns as well as heavenly promises. His sermons often focused on the practical application of Christian principles to the challenges of ranching life, and his counsel was sought by believers and skeptics alike. The Reverend was tending his small garden behind the church when Sam approached, pulling weeds with the methodical attention of someone who found peace in simple physical tasks. Morrison looked up with a smile that faded quickly when he read the trouble in Sam's expression. "Samuel," Morrison said, rising and brushing dirt from his knees. "I've been meaning to come see you, but I wasn't sure what comfort I could offer. Sometimes God's plan is difficult for us to understand." "Reverend," Sam said, struggling to find words for the moral complexity of his situation, "I need to ask you about something that's been troubling me, something that might not be entirely conventional." Morrison gestured toward two wooden chairs, positioned in the shade of a large pine tree. "Sit with me, son. In my experience, the most important conversations usually begin with someone worried about convention." Sam settled into the chair, grateful for the privacy the garden provided. "Reverend, if a man had the opportunity to help children who desperately needed homes, but the way he helped them involved paying money for them, would that be morally wrong?" Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "Are we talking about adoption, Samuel?" "Something like that," Sam replied. "There's an auction in Great Falls where orphan children from back east are being placed with Western families. The families pay fees to cover transportation and legal costs, but it's still paying money for human beings." The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving across the peaceful garden where beans and squash grew in neat rows. "Samuel, are you considering attending this auction?" "I don't know," Sam admitted. "Part of me thinks it's wrong, but part of me thinks maybe those children need someone who'll worry about whether it's wrong. Someone who sees them as more than just workers." Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "In Scripture, we're told that pure religion involves caring for orphans and widows in their distress. The method matters less than the intention and the outcome. If you're asking whether it's moral to help children by participating in a flawed system, I'd say that depends on whether you're planning to exploit that system or reform it." "What do you mean?" "I mean," Morrison said carefully, "that sometimes we find ourselves in situations where all the available choices have moral complications. The question isn't whether we can avoid moral complexity, but whether we can navigate it with integrity and compassion." Sam told Morrison about Webb's proposal, about the possibility of establishing an agricultural training program in Colorado that could serve other orphaned children beyond those he might initially adopt. As he spoke, he watched the Reverend's expression shift from concern to interest to something approaching excitement. "Samuel," Morrison said when Sam finished, "what you're describing sounds like it could be God's work disguised as a business transaction. Those children need homes, skills, and someone who sees their potential. You need a new purpose and the means to rebuild your life. Perhaps your tragedy is preparing you for their opportunity." The conversation with Morrison provided Sam with the moral framework he needed to make his decision. That evening, he wrote a letter to Webb accepting the loan and confirming his intention to attend the Great Falls auction. The letter was brief, but writing it felt like stepping across a threshold into unknown territory. The journey to Great Falls took 2 days of hard riding across country that grew progressively wilder as Sam moved away from the familiar valleys of his childhood. The landscape shifted from pastoral ranchland to rolling hills covered with sage brush and cut by deep coulees where eagles nested in sandstone cliffs. This was Montana Territory at its most elemental, vast, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human ambition. Sam made camp the first night beside a creek where cottonwood trees provided shelter from the wind. As he sat by his small fire, eating beans and hardtack while his horses grazed nearby, he tried to imagine the children he might meet at the auction. Webb had said they ranged in age from 5 to 16, that they had survived on the streets of Chicago before being gathered by the Aid Society. What kind of experiences had shaped them? What fears and hopes would they bring to a Montana ranch? The questions multiplied as the fire burned lower. How would he explain ranch work to children who had never seen cattle? How would he provide schooling in a territory where teachers were scarce and books even scarcer? How would he maintain discipline and structure while also providing the affection and security that traumatized children needed? Sam had grown up understanding that ranching required constant adaptation to changing conditions, drought, flood, market fluctuations, disease outbreaks. But those challenges had prepared him for managing livestock and land, not for the infinitely more complex task of raising human beings. The magnitude of what he was contemplating began to feel overwhelming as the Montana darkness pressed in around his lonely camp. The second day brought him within sight of Great Falls, where the Missouri River carved its way through a series of dramatic cascades that had given the town its name. The settlement had grown rapidly since the railroad's arrival, its population swelled by farmers, merchants, and opportunists drawn by the promise of prosperity in the developing territory. Steam rose from the river where sawmills operated around. The clock and the sound of construction filled the air as new buildings rose to house the steady stream of settlers, arriving on every train. Sam checked into Morrison's Hotel, a 3-story building that represented the height of frontier luxury with its carpeted lobby and dining room that served meals on real china. After weeks of sleeping on the ground and eating beans from a tin plate, the hotel's amenities felt almost decadently comfortable. But the luxury was tainted by nervousness about the following day's auction. That evening, Sam walked through Great Falls' bustling streets, observing the mix of established residents and recent arrivals who gave the town its restless energy. Cowboys and farmers mingled with businessmen in Eastern suits, while women in practical frontier dresses conducted their shopping alongside ladies whose elaborate bonnets and parasols suggested more refined origins. At the Silver Dollar Saloon, Sam nursed a whiskey while listening to conversations about land prices, railroad expansion, and the opportunities available to men with capital and ambition. The optimism was infectious. Great Falls was a town convinced of its own bright future, but Sam felt like an imposter among these confident settlers. They were building something. He was trying to salvage the wreckage of dreams that had already failed. "You look like a man carrying heavy thoughts," observed the bartender, a grizzled veteran of the California gold rush who had migrated north when Montana's mining boom began. "Anything a stranger might help you sort through?" Sam considered the offer, tempted by the prospect of sharing his burden with someone who had no stake in his decision. "Ever hear of the Orphan Train program?" The bartender's expression grew serious. "Heard of it. Seen some of those children come through town on their way to ranches up north. Seemed like good kids mostly. Some looked relieved to be getting a fresh start. Others looked scared about what they were getting into. What happened to them? The ones you saw?" "Mixed results," the bartender replied honestly. "Some folks took them children for the right reasons, treated them like family. Others just wanted cheap labor and didn't much care about anything else. Depends on the person doing the adopting, I guess." The conversation reinforced what Sam already knew. The system's morality depended entirely on the participants' intentions and character. Children would be placed with families regardless of his participation. The question was whether his involvement would improve or diminish their prospects. That night, Sam lay awake in his hotel bed, listening to the sounds of the growing town outside his window. Somewhere in Great Falls, 5 children were probably experiencing their own sleepless night, wondering what tomorrow would bring. They had traveled hundreds of miles from everything familiar, trusting their futures to strangers who saw them primarily as solutions to labor shortages out by morning. Sam had made his final decision. He would attend the auction, and if the right children were available, children who seemed capable of thriving in the demanding environment of a working ranch, he would bid on them. Not as property to be purchased, but as partners in building something unprecedented in the American West. The choice felt both terrifying and inevitable, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that jumping was the only way forward. Great Falls Courthouse stood like a monument to civilization's attempt to impose order on the wild Montana territory. Built of red brick hauled from St. Louis and crowned with a clock tower that chimed the hours across the bustling settlement, it represented everything the frontier aspired to become: permanent, dignified, and unshakably confident in the rule of law. Sam Harrison arrived at the courthouse steps as the morning sun painted the building's facade with golden light. Already, a crowd had gathered on the broad lawn, and the mixture of voices created a low rumble that spoke of anticipation, anxiety, and barely contained excitement. These were not the usual participants in livestock auctions, ranchers evaluating beef cattle or farmers seeking draft horses. This crowd included well-dressed merchants' wives clutching their husbands' arms, weathered homesteaders who had traveled days to attend, and a surprising number of single men whose motivations Sam could only guess at. The Illinois Children's Aid Society had erected a small platform beside the courthouse steps, draped with patriotic bunting that fluttered in the morning breeze. A large banner proclaimed, "A new beginning for America's forgotten children," while smaller signs provided details about the adoption process, legal requirements, and payment terms. The whole arrangement had an unsettling carnival atmosphere that made Sam's stomach churn with discomfort. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the Aid Society's regional coordinator, stood beside the platform consulting a leather-bound ledger while speaking in urgent whispers with a tall man in a black suit. Whitman was a formidable woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her dress was expensive but practical, designed for a woman who conducted serious business in challenging conditions. "Gentlemen and ladies," Mrs. Whitman announced, her voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd, "we will begin the placement proceedings in precisely 15 minutes. I want to review the terms one final time to ensure there are no misunderstandings." She opened her ledger and began reading from prepared notes. "Each child has been medically examined, educated in basic literacy and arithmetic, and trained to age-appropriate domestic or agricultural tasks. The placement fees range from $50 for younger children to $200 for adolescents with specialized skills. These fees cover transportation costs, legal documentation, and the Society's ongoing support services." Sam listened with growing unease as Whitman described the children like livestock being prepared for market. Each child's qualities were enumerated with clinical precision: their health status, educational achievements, and demonstrated work capabilities. The language was carefully chosen to emphasize the children's value as investments, while maintaining a veneer of humanitarian concern. "The children will be presented individually," Whitman continued, allowing prospective families to evaluate their suitability for specific household needs. Successful bidders will complete adoption paperwork immediately following the auction, and the children will be released to their new families today. Released, Sam thought grimly, as if they were prisoners being granted parole rather than children being placed with families who would shape their entire futures. The first child called to the platform was a boy of perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair that had been carefully combed and clothes that were clean but obviously borrowed from the Aid Society's donation supplies. He stood straight back on the platform, his eyes scanning the crowd with a mixture of curiosity and carefully controlled fear. "This is Timothy O'Malley," Mrs. Whitman announced, consulting her notes. Age 8 years, orphaned when his parents died in the Chicago cholera outbreak. Timothy can read at a 4th grade level, performs basic arithmetic, and has demonstrated exceptional skill in caring for livestock. He's healthy, obedient, and eager to contribute to a hardworking family. Timothy remained motionless as potential adopters studied him with the same appraising attention they might give a young horse at a breeding auction. Sam watched the boy's face, seeing the effort it took to maintain his composure while being evaluated like merchandise. There was intelligence in Timothy's eyes, and a resilience that spoke of experiences no 8-year-old should have endured. "Bidding opens at $50, Mrs. Whitman declared. Hands rose throughout the crowd, and Sam listened with growing horror as the price climbed steadily higher. The bidders called out their offers with the same casual enthusiasm they might show for agricultural equipment, while Timothy stood frozen on the platform, understanding that his future was being determined by strangers whose primary concern was his potential economic value. $75, called a prosperous-looking farmer whose expensive boots and well-tailored coat suggested successful operations. $85, countered a woman whose pinched expression and calculating gaze made Sam instinctively distrust her motives. The bidding continued until Timothy was sold for $110 to a rancher from the Judith Basin who announced his intention to train the boy in sheep herding. Timothy was led from the platform without ceremony, his new owner completing paperwork while the child stood silently beside him, his small hands clasped behind his back in a gesture that spoke of trained obedience rather than natural behavior. Second child was a girl named Rebecca, perhaps 12 years old, with auburn hair and green eyes that held an unmistakable spark of defiance despite her circumstances. Mrs. Whitman described Rebecca's qualifications: literacy beyond her age level, experience in commercial laundry operations, and demonstrated skills in food preparation and household management. Rebecca has shown leadership qualities among the other children, Whitman noted, though her tone suggested this wasn't entirely considered an asset. She will require a firm hand but should prove invaluable to a family needing domestic help. Rebecca's bidding was more competitive than Timothy's, with several families competing for a child whose capabilities clearly exceeded her years. Sam found himself studying the bidders' faces, trying to read their intentions. Were they seeing a young girl who needed guidance and affection, or were they calculating the economic value of someone who could manage a household while still being fed and housed at minimal cost? When Rebecca was finally purchased by a merchant's family from Helena for $160, Sam saw her jaw tighten with what looked like determination rather than resignation. This was a child who would not be easily broken, regardless of her circumstances. Whether that would work in her favor or against her would depend entirely on her new family's character. The third child changed everything. "This is David Chun," Mrs. Whitman announced, and Sam felt his breath catch as a slight boy of perhaps 10 years climbed the steps to the platform. David was clearly of Chinese ancestry, with straight black hair and dark eyes that held depths of sadness Sam could feel across the courtyard. The boy moved with careful precision, as if conserving energy or avoiding actions that might provoke unwanted attention. David's parents operated a laundry in Chicago's Chinatown before succumbing to the recent epidemic. Whitman continued, her voice betraying slight discomfort with David's presence. Despite language barriers, David has mastered English literacy and demonstrates exceptional mathematical abilities. He's experienced in operating complex machinery and has shown remarkable adaptability to new situations. The crowd's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversations stopped, and an uncomfortable silence settled over the assembly. In 1889 Montana Territory, anti-Chinese sentiment ran high, fueled by economic competition and racial prejudice that had followed Chinese immigrants west from California's gold fields. David's presence at the auction represented a challenge to social conventions that many attendees were unwilling to accept. "Bidding opens at $50, Mrs. Whitman announced, but her words met with silence. Sam watched David's face as the seconds stretched without a single raised hand. The boy's expression remained carefully neutral, but Sam could see the gradual realization dawning. He was unwanted not because of any personal failing, but because of his ancestry. The rejection was absolute and public, and David absorbed it with the stoic acceptance of someone who had learned not to expect fairness from the world. "Surely someone can recognize this child's obvious intelligence and work ethic," Mrs. Whitman pressed, her professional composure beginning to show cracks. "David's mathematical abilities are truly exceptional. Any family involved in commerce or accounting would benefit enormously from his skills." Still silence. Sam felt anger building in his chest as he watched respected members of the community turn away from a child whose only crime was being born to Chinese parents. This was the same prejudice that had driven Chinese laborers from mining camps and prevented Asian families from owning property in most Western territories. $25, Mrs. Whitman finally announced, reducing David's opening bid below that of any previous child. Surely someone can see past superficial differences to recognize genuine value. Sam's hand rose before he consciously decided to bid. $50, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly attentive crowd. Heads turned toward him, and Sam could feel the weight of curious and disapproving stares. Mrs. Whitman looked relieved that someone had finally made an offer, while several community members began whispering among themselves about the stranger willing to adopt a Chinese child. $50 to the gentleman in the gray hat, Mrs. Whitman announced. "Do I hear 60? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Long before Mrs. Whitman declared David sold to Sam for $50, less than half what the previous children had commanded. As Sam approached the platform to complete the paperwork, he found himself looking into David's eyes for the first time. What he saw there surprised him. Not gratitude or relief, but a careful evaluation, as if David was assessing his new guardian's character and motivations. This was a child who had learned to trust cautiously, and Sam realized that earning David's confidence would require more than simply outbidding his prejudiced competitors. The fourth child introduced was Martha Sullivan, a red-haired girl of 14 whose freckled face and defiant posture immediately reminded Sam of his own stubborn streak. Mrs. Whitman described Martha's qualifications with obvious enthusiasm: advanced literacy, experience in teaching younger children, and demonstrated leadership abilities that had made her invaluable during the Orphans' journey west. "Martha has essentially served as an assistant to our staff throughout the transportation process," Whitman noted. "She has a natural gift for organization and has shown remarkable maturity in helping younger children adapt to their circumstances." Martha's bidding was fierce, with multiple families recognizing her potential value as both a household manager and substitute teacher in a territory where educated women were scarce. Sam found himself competing against a banker's family from Billings and a rancher's widow who needed help managing both her household and her deceased husband's business interests. As the bidding climbed past $150, Sam began to question his financial strategy. Webb's loan was substantial but not unlimited, and he still needed money for travel expenses and establishing operations in Colorado. But something about Martha's combination of intelligence and determination convinced him that she could be instrumental in making his ambitious plan succeed. $200, Sam announced, pushing the bidding beyond what most competitors seemed willing to pay. The banker's family consulted among themselves before shaking their heads and stepping back. The rancher's widow held Sam's gaze for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions, before finally nodding her withdrawal from the competition. "Sold for $200, Mrs. Whitman declared, and Sam saw Martha's shoulders relax slightly. He suspected she had been dreading placement with some of the other bidders. and her relief suggested she viewed him as the lesser of several evils. The final child changed Sam's entire understanding of what he was undertaking. "This is James Peterson," Mrs. Whitman announced, and Sam's heart nearly stopped as a boy who couldn't have been older than 6 climbed the platform steps with obvious difficulty. James was painfully thin, with pale blonde hair and blue eyes that seemed too large for his gaunt face. More concerning was the way he favored his left leg, moving with the careful gait of someone managing chronic pain. "James's parents died in a tenement fire," Whitman explained, her voice taking on a more subdued tone. "He sustained injuries during the incident that have left him with some physical limitations. However, James is remarkably intelligent and has shown exceptional skill in detailed handwork that doesn't require significant physical exertion." The crowd's reaction was immediate and devastating. Parents who had bid competitively for healthy children suddenly found pressing reasons to examine their pocket watches or study the courthouse architecture. A physically disabled child represented not an asset, but a burden, someone who would consume resources without providing proportional economic value. "James can read fluently and has demonstrated remarkable artistic abilities," Mrs. Whitman pressed desperately. "He would be ideal for a family involved in bookkeeping, tailoring, or any trade requiring precision and patience." The silence stretched painfully long. Sam watched James's face, seeing the child's growing understanding that he was being rejected not for any personal failing but for circumstances entirely beyond his control. The 6-year-old's composure began to crack, and Sam saw tears gathering in his enormous blue eyes. "Bidding opens at $25, Mrs. Whitman announced, her voice heavy with resignation. No hands rose. James stood alone on the platform, a tiny figure bearing the weight of societal indifference with heartbreaking dignity. Sam realized with growing horror that this child might remain unplaced, destined for an institutional life that would likely kill him before he reached adulthood. $50, Sam called out, his voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence like a blade. Mrs. Whitman's relief was palpable. $50 to Mr. Harrison. Do I hear 60? The silence that followed was absolute. Sam's offer stood alone, and after the required waiting period, James was declared sold for the minimum possible amount to a man who was beginning to understand that he had committed himself to something far more complex than agricultural training. As Sam completed the paperwork for his 5 new charges, he found himself the center of considerable attention. Other auction attendees studied him with expressions ranging from curiosity to disapproval, clearly wondering what motivated a single man to adopt 5 children, including a Chinese boy and a disabled child that no one else wanted. Mrs. Whitman handed Sam the completed adoption documents along with a manila envelope containing each child's limited records. "Mr. Harrison," she said quietly, "I want you to know that you've made some unconventional choices today. These children will require patience and understanding that not every adoptive family is prepared to provide." "Mrs. Whitman," Sam replied, looking at his 5 new charges who stood in a small cluster nearby, "I suspect these children have more to teach me than I have to teach them." As the auction concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sam found himself standing with 5 orphaned children whose futures now rested entirely in his inexperienced hands. David watched him with cautious intelligence. Martha studied their surroundings with obvious strategic thinking. James leaned against a wooden post to ease the strain on his injured leg, while the 2 other children, whose stories he had yet to fully understand, waited for their new guardian to indicate what would happen next. The magnitude of what he had committed to was beginning to sink in. These weren't just workers for his proposed ranch. They were human beings who would look to him for everything from daily meals to guidance about their place in the world. The responsibility felt overwhelming, but as Sam looked into their faces, he also saw something that surprised him: hope. Despite everything they had endured, these children still believed that better days were possible. That belief, Sam realized, would either destroy him or transform him into someone worthy of their trust. The journey to Colorado would begin tomorrow, and with it, the most challenging undertaking of Samuel Harrison's life, the Great Falls boarding house where Sam secured rooms for the night, buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that had nothing to do with the usual frontier bustle. Word of the afternoon's auction had spread quickly through the small community, and Sam found himself the subject of curious stares and whispered conversations whenever he appeared in the lobby or dining room. A single man adopting 5 children was unusual enough. Adopting a Chinese boy and a disabled child made him either a saint or a fool, depending on who was doing the talking. Sam had requested 2 adjoining rooms on the second floor, one for himself and James, whose injured leg made climbing stairs difficult, and another for David, Martha, and the remaining 2 children whose names he was still learning to match with faces. The arrangement felt awkward and temporary, like a poorly planned camping expedition rather than the beginning of a new family structure. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the boarding house's modest dining room, Sam found himself sitting across a worn wooden table from 5 children who studied him with the wary attention of survivors evaluating a new threat. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they picked at plates of beef stew and cornbread, the kind of hearty frontier fare that represented luxury to children accustomed to charity meals and uncertain food sources. Martha Sullivan was the first to break the silence, her 14-year-old directness cutting through the awkwardness like a knife through butter. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her Irish accent still detectable despite months of trying to sound more American, "we need to understand what you expect from us. Are we workers you've purchased, or are we supposed to pretend we're some kind of family?" The question hung in the air with brutal honesty. Sam set down his spoon, recognizing that Martha's challenge represented a crucial moment in establishing the foundation for everything that would follow. These children had learned not to trust adult promises, and they deserved straightforward answers rather than sentimental platitudes. "That's a fair question, Martha," Sam replied, meeting her steady gaze. "And I'll give you a fair answer. I bought you because the system required it, but I don't own you. What I'm hoping to build is something between a family and a business partnership." David Chun looked up from his barely touched meal, his dark eyes reflecting intelligence and skepticism in equal measure. "What kind of business, Mr. Harrison? And what happens to us if the business fails?" Sam had expected practical questions from children who had learned to think strategically about their survival, but David's directness still caught him off guard. Here was a 10-year-old who understood that economic arrangements shaped human relationships, and who wanted clear terms before committing to any new situation. "I'm planning to establish a ranch in Colorado," Sam explained, choosing his words carefully. "Not just cattle ranching, but something new. A place where children like yourselves can learn agricultural and business skills while we build something profitable together. If the business succeeds, you all benefit. If it fails..." He paused, recognizing the weight of the promise he was about to make. "If it fails, I'll make sure you're placed with families who will treat you well, not abandoned to institutions." 6-year-old James Peterson had been listening intently, despite his obvious exhaustion from the day's events. Now he spoke up with the careful diction of a child who had learned that clear communication could mean the difference between help and harm. "Mr. Harrison, what if we can't do the work? What if we're not strong enough or smart enough?" The question revealed the fear that drove much of these children's behavior, the terror of being found inadequate and discarded like defective merchandise. Sam looked around the table, seeing in each young face the evidence of lives shaped by constant evaluation, constant pressure to prove their worth through performance rather than simply existing as human beings deserving care and protection. "James," Sam said gently, "I didn't choose any of you because I thought you were perfect workers. I chose you because I saw something in each of you that reminded me of myself when I was young and trying to figure out how to survive in a world that didn't seem to have much use for me. Martha's eyebrows rose skeptically. What exactly did you see, Mr. Harrison? Because from where we're sitting, you look like a man who's made some impulsive decisions he might regret when the reality sets in. Sam couldn't help but smile at Martha's bluntness, recognizing in her attitude the same stubborn independence that had driven his own youth. I saw David being rejected by that crowd, not because he lacked ability, but because they couldn't see past their own prejudices. I saw you taking charge of the other children during the auction process, making sure they understood what was happening and felt less afraid. I saw James standing on that platform with more dignity than most of the adults in the crowd could muster. He gestured toward the two children he was still getting to know. 9-year-old Lucy Chun, no relation to David, despite the shared surname assigned by the Aid Society, and 11-year-old Robert Hayes, both of whom had been listening intently while saying little. I saw Lucy organizing the younger children's belongings while we waited for the paperwork, making sure nothing was lost in the confusion. And I saw Robert calculating something on his fingers during the auction, probably figuring out how much money was being spent and what that might mean for his future. Lucy looked up with surprise, apparently not realizing her actions had been noticed. Robert's face flushed slightly, confirming Sam's guess about his mathematical calculations. These children had learned to observe and analyze their environments with the intensity of strategists planning campaigns, and Sam was beginning to understand that their survival skills might prove more valuable than any formal education they could receive. So what happens tomorrow? David asked, his practical nature driving the conversation toward immediate concerns. Do we start traveling to Colorado immediately, or is there some kind of preparation period? Sam had been wrestling with logistical questions since completing the adoption paperwork, understanding that 5 children and 2 horses presented transportation challenges he hadn't fully considered when making his impulsive decision to attend the auction. Tomorrow we purchase supplies in a larger wagon, Sam replied. The journey to Colorado will take at least 2 weeks, possibly longer depending on weather and road conditions. We'll need food, camping equipment, and warmer clothes for mountain travel. Martha leaned forward, her expression shifting from skepticism to interest. Where in Colorado are we going? Do you already have land picked out, or are we heading into completely unknown territory? Unknown territory, Sam admitted. I've been researching homestead opportunities in the San Luis Valley, near the town of Alamosa. The government is offering land grants to anyone willing to establish agricultural or educational operations in developing areas. Good soil, reliable water, and room to grow. Educational operations? Lucy asked, speaking up for the first time since their conversation began. Her voice was soft but clear, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had worked hard to master English as a second language. Does that mean we'll have school? Sam nodded, recognizing the hunger in her question. Part of what I want to build is a place where children can learn practical skills alongside traditional subjects. Reading, writing, and arithmetic, but also animal husbandry, crop management, basic engineering, things that will serve you no matter what you choose to do with your lives. Robert Hayes finally joined the conversation, his voice carrying the slightly hoarse quality of someone who rarely spoke unless he had something important to say. Mr. Harrison, have you ever taught anyone anything before? Or are you planning to learn how to be a teacher at the same time you're learning how to raise 5 children? The question cut to the heart of Sam's deepest anxieties about his ambitious plans. He had practical experience managing ranch operations, but absolutely no background in education or child rearing. His confidence in his ability to provide what these children needed was based more on determination than demonstrated competence. Robert, you've identified the flaw in my plan, Sam said with rueful honesty. I've never taught anyone anything except how to rope cattle and fix broken fence posts. But I figure learning together might be better than having someone who thinks they already know everything trying to force their ideas on you. The admission seemed to relax something in the group dynamic. These children had been managed by adults who claimed expertise they didn't possess, and Sam's honest acknowledgement of his limitations was more reassuring than false confidence would have been. "Can we make suggestions?" Martha asked. "About how things should work, I mean. We've had experience with different kinds of arrangements, and we might know what works and what doesn't." "I'm counting on suggestions," Sam replied. "In fact, I'm counting on a lot more than suggestions. This only works if we're all invested in making it succeed." James had been growing increasingly tired as the evening progressed, his injured leg clearly causing discomfort after the day's excitement. Now he spoke up with the kind of practical concern that seemed to come naturally to children who had learned to manage their own care. "Mr. Harrison, I need to tell you something about my leg. It's never going to be completely normal, and there are some things I just can't do. If you're expecting me to keep up with heavy ranch work, you're going to be disappointed." Sam looked at the 6-year-old who was matter-of-factly describing his physical limitations with the clinical detachment of someone much older. The conversation reminded him of discussions with veterinarians about injured livestock, except this was a child discussing his own body as if it were equipment that required accommodation rather than part of himself that deserved compassion. "James," Sam said carefully, "I don't know much about working with physical disabilities, but I figure between all of us, we can find ways for everyone to contribute that match their abilities. A successful operation needs people who can think as well as people who can lift heavy things. What about David?" Martha asked, glancing at the Chinese boy who had remained quietly attentive throughout the conversation. "There are places in Colorado where Chinese people aren't welcome. How are you planning to handle that?" David answered before Sam could respond, his voice steady but tinged with the weariness of someone who had dealt with prejudice his entire life. "I've learned to make myself useful enough that people overlook what I look like, and I know how to stay out of trouble when that's not possible." The casual acceptance in David's voice, a 10-year-old child discussing strategies for managing racial hatred, struck Sam like a physical blow. These children had been forced to develop survival skills that no child should need, and their matter-of-fact discussions of discrimination and disability revealed how thoroughly the adult world had failed them. "David," Sam said firmly, "you shouldn't have to make yourself invisible to be safe. One of the things I'm hoping to build is a place where people are valued for their abilities and character, not judged by things they can't control." "That's a nice idea, Mr. Harrison," David replied with gentle skepticism. "But the world outside our ranch isn't going to change just because we want it to. We need practical plans for dealing with practical problems." The conversation continued as the dining room gradually emptied around them, other boarding house guests retiring for the evening while Sam and his new charges worked through the logistics and expectations that would shape their unconventional arrangement. By the time they finally made their way upstairs, Sam felt both exhausted and oddly exhilarated. These children were nothing like the compliant workers he had initially imagined. They were intelligent, independent, and accustomed to taking responsibility for their own welfare in ways that both impressed and saddened him. Building something successful with them would require treating them as partners rather than dependents, collaborators rather than subordinates. As Sam helped James settle into the narrow bed they would share, the injured boy looked up with an expression of cautious optimism that hadn't been there during the auction. "Mr. Harrison," James said quietly, "I want you to know that we're all scared about what comes next. But we're also excited. None of us has ever had someone ask what we thought about our own futures before." Sam felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "James, I want you to know that I'm scared too. But I think maybe being scared together is better than being scared alone." Outside their window, the sounds of Great Falls, settling into evening quiet, provided a backdrop for the monumental changes taking place in both Sam's life and the lives of 5 children who had learned to expect very little from the adults responsible for their care. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time in months, Sam fell asleep feeling like he had a purpose worth pursuing. The test of their unconventional family was just beginning, but the foundation they had started building around Martha's kitchen table might prove strong enough to support the weight of their shared ambitions. In the adjoining room, 5 children lay in their beds planning strategies for surviving whatever came next, while gradually allowing themselves to hope that this time might be different, that this adult might actually mean what he said about treating them as partners rather than property. Time would tell whether Sam Harrison's promises were worth the trust they were slowly beginning to offer. But for tonight, hope felt like a luxury they could finally afford. Dawn broke over Great Falls with the crisp promise of autumn weather, painting the Missouri River Valley in shades of gold and amber that reminded Sam of better days on his family's ranch. But this morning brought challenges he had never faced before, preparing 5 children for a journey into unknown territory while learning the basics of group leadership on the fly. The previous evening's conversation had established ground rules and expectations, but the reality of traveling 2 weeks across difficult terrain with children, ranging from 6 to 14 years old, presented logistical puzzles that no amount of ranching experience had prepared him to solve. Standing in the boarding house's modest dining room, watching his new charges methodically pack their few belongings with the efficiency of seasoned travelers, Sam realized that these children possessed survival skills he was only beginning to appreciate. Martha Sullivan had assumed unofficial leadership of the group's preparations, organizing their meager possessions with military precision, while quietly assessing each child's physical and emotional readiness for the journey ahead. Her 14 years had been compressed into experiences that would have challenged adults, and she approached their departure with the strategic thinking of someone who understood that poor planning could have fatal consequences. "Mr. Harrison," Martha said, approaching Sam with a hand-drawn list that detailed their supply needs, "we've been discussing the wagon situation, and we have some concerns about space and weight distribution." Sam studied the list, impressed by its thoroughness. Martha had calculated food requirements based on each person's age and estimated caloric needs, identified clothing necessities for mountain weather, and even considered medical supplies for treating injuries or illness during their journey. The document revealed mathematical skills and practical knowledge that rivaled anything he might have learned in formal schooling. "What kind of concerns?" Sam asked, recognizing that Martha's questions usually concealed important information. She was testing whether he was prepared to handle. "David's been calculating wagon capacity based on the size of vehicle you can afford," Martha explained, gesturing toward the Chinese boy who was consulting a small notebook filled with neat columns of figures. "With 7 people, food for 2 weeks, camping equipment, and personal belongings, we're going to exceed the weight limit of a standard freight wagon." David approached with his calculations, his dark eyes serious as he presented findings that demonstrated both mathematical ability and practical engineering knowledge. "Mr. Harrison, based on your budget and the available vehicles in Great Falls, you can afford either a heavy freight wagon that can carry our supplies but will travel slowly over mountain roads, or a lighter passenger wagon that moves faster but can't accommodate everything we need." Sam studied David's figures, understanding that the boy had identified a fundamental problem with their travel plans. Speed versus capacity was the kind of trade-off that defines success or failure in frontier situations, and making the wrong choice could leave them stranded without adequate supplies or vulnerable to early winter weather in the Colorado mountains. "What do you recommend?" Sam asked, genuinely curious about David's analysis. "We think you should buy the freight wagon and accept that the journey will take longer," David replied. "Mountain weather is unpredictable, and having extra food and warm clothing is more important than reaching Colorado quickly." Robert Hayes, who had been listening intently while organizing his own belongings, spoke up with the careful precision that characterized all his communications. "There's another consideration. Mr. Harrison, the heavier wagon will require additional horses or mules, which increases your initial expense, but provides backup if we lose animals to injury or illness." Sam felt a growing appreciation for the analytical abilities these children had developed through necessity. Their discussions revealed thinking processes that combined formal education with hard-won experience, creating insights that neither pure academics nor pure practical knowledge could have achieved alone. "How do you know so much about wagon travel?" Sam asked, genuinely curious about the sources of their expertise. "Lucy," Chun answered with the quiet voice that seemed to characterize her contributions to group discussions. "We rode trains and wagons for 6 weeks getting here from Chicago. You learn things when your life depends on the transportation working properly." The casual reference to life-threatening travel conditions reminded Sam that these children's journey to Montana had been far more perilous than he had initially understood. They weren't just orphans seeking new homes. They were survivors of a cross-country expedition that had tested their resourcefulness and resilience in ways most adults never experienced. James Peterson, despite his physical limitations, had been contributing to the planning process with observations that reflected careful attention to details others might miss. Now he spoke up with information that proved his value extended far beyond his ability to perform manual labor. "Mr. Harrison, while we were waiting at the train station yesterday, I watched the wagon traders conducting business. The honest dealers let customers inspect their vehicles thoroughly and provide written guarantees for major components. The dishonest ones rush sales and discourage detailed examination." Sam stared at the 6-year-old who was providing advice about evaluating commercial transactions with the sophistication of an experienced businessman. "James, how did you learn to recognize those differences?" "When your survival depends on adults making good decisions about transportation and supplies, you pay attention to how those decisions get made," James replied matter-of-factly. "We've seen what happens when people trust the wrong dealers or buy inadequate equipment." The morning shopping expedition became an education in group dynamics and collaborative decision-making. Sam had initially planned to make purchasing decisions based on his own judgment and experience, but he quickly realized that his new charges possessed knowledge and insights that could prevent costly mistakes. At Morrison's Wagon and Livestock Exchange, the largest dealer in Great Falls, Sam found himself accompanied by 5 children, who approached the selection process with the intensity of military strategists planning a campaign. Martha examined wagon construction with an engineer's attention to structural integrity, while David calculated payload capacities and compared prices with mathematical precision. Robert studied the dealer's sales techniques, providing Sam with whispered assessments of the man's honesty and competence. Lucy inspected harness equipment and camping supplies with the expertise of someone who understood the difference between essential and optional equipment. Even James contributed, pointing out design features that would accommodate his physical limitations while providing maximum utility for the group. "That wagon looks sturdy," Sam commented, indicating a heavy freight vehicle with iron-reinforced wheels and a canvas cover designed for weather protection. "It is sturdy," Martha agreed. "But look at the rear axle assembly. Those bolts show stress marks that suggest previous overloading. This wagon has been worked hard, possibly beyond its design specifications." David consulted his notebook before adding his own observations. "The dealer's asking price is 15% above market value for a vehicle of this age and condition. Either he's testing whether you know the fair price, or he's factoring in repair costs you haven't been told about." Sam felt simultaneously impressed and slightly intimidated by the children's expertise. They were approaching this transaction with analytical skills he associated with experienced businessmen, not orphan children buying their first wagon. Their knowledge had been earned through experiences he could only imagine, and their insights were preventing him from making expensive mistakes. The dealer, a heavy-set man named Patterson, who wore expensive boots and maintained the jovial demeanor of someone accustomed to separating customers from their money, initially tried to dismiss the children's questions and observations. But their persistence and obvious knowledge gradually changed his approach from condescension to grudging respect. "You folks seem to know your business," Patterson finally acknowledged after David had pointed out 3 separate attempts to inflate prices for optional equipment. "Most customers don't ask the kind of questions you're asking. We've learned that asking questions up front prevents problems later," Martha replied diplomatically. "We're planning a long journey over difficult terrain, and we need equipment that won't fail when we're depending on it." The final purchase reflected the group's collaborative analysis. They selected a freight wagon that balanced capacity with reliability, 4 draft horses that showed good health and appropriate temperament, and supplies carefully chosen for durability and efficiency. The total cost exceeded Sam's original budget, but the children's expertise had prevented him from buying inferior equipment that might have failed during their journey. As they loaded their supplies and prepared to leave Great Falls, Sam realized that the dynamic between himself and the children had already begun evolving in unexpected directions. Rather than serving as their instructor and guide, he was becoming part of a team where each member contributed specialized knowledge and skills. The wagon train that departed Great Falls consisted of their single heavy freight wagon pulled by 4 sturdy horses, with Sam handling the driving while the children organized themselves according to abilities and preferences. Martha rode beside him on the driver's bench, serving as navigator and group coordinator. David and Robert shared responsibility for monitoring their supplies and calculating daily progress toward their destination. Lucy had appointed herself guardian of their small library, books and educational materials Sam had purchased at Martha's insistence, while James managed their medical supplies and documented their journey in a leather journal. Mrs. Caldwell had given Sam and Bitter Creek the boy's artistic abilities, which had been mentioned during the auction, proved invaluable for creating maps and illustrations that supplemented his written observations. Their first day's travel took them south from Great Falls, along wagon roads that followed the Missouri River Valley before turning toward the mountain passes that would carry them into Colorado territory. The landscape gradually shifted from the rolling plains of central Montana to more rugged terrain where pine forests covered hills that rose toward distant peaks, already dusted with early snow. The children's behavior during their first day of travel revealed adaptive strategies developed through their previous journey west. They conserved energy during the easier stretches, stayed alert for potential hazards, and worked together to solve problems before they became serious difficulties. Their cooperation had nothing to do with adult supervision and everything to do with shared understanding that their welfare depended on group success. During their midday rest stop beside a clear mountain stream, Sam watched his charges organize their activities with minimal discussion or direction. Martha supervised food preparation, while David calculated their progress and estimated arrival times for various landmarks. Robert studied their route and identified potential challenges in the terrain ahead, while Lucy organized their educational materials for evening lessons around the campfire. James, despite his physical limitations, had found ways to contribute that matched his abilities perfectly. His artistic documentation of their journey was creating a record that would prove valuable for future travelers, while his careful attention to medical supplies ensured they were prepared for injuries or illness that might occur during their trip. "How are you feeling about this?" Sam asked Martha during the quiet moment while the other children explored the area around their rest stop. "Honestly," Martha replied, her Irish directness cutting through any attempt at polite conversation, "I feel like we're finally doing something that might actually work. For the first time since leaving Chicago, we're not just being moved around by people who see us as problems to be solved." What's different about this? Martha considered the question carefully before answering. You ask our opinions about decisions that affect us. You listen when we have information that might help. Most adults tell us what's going to happen and expect us to be grateful for whatever we get. Sam felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness at Martha's assessment. Pride that his approach was working, sadness that these children's previous experiences had taught them to expect so little from the adults responsible for their care. That evening, as they established their first camp in a sheltered grove beside the wagon road, Sam began to understand the rhythm that would define their journey. The children worked together with practiced efficiency, setting up their sleeping arrangements, preparing dinner, and organizing evening activities without requiring constant supervision or direction around the campfire, with mountain stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Sam found himself part of conversations that ranged from practical planning to philosophical discussions about their future goals and aspirations. These weren't just homeless children grateful for basic care. They were intelligent young people with ideas and ambitions that deserved respect and encouragement. As the fire burned lower and the children prepared for sleep, Sam realized that the most challenging part of their journey wasn't going to be the mountain roads or uncertain weather. It was going to be living up to the trust these remarkable young people were gradually beginning to offer him. Tomorrow would bring new tests of their unconventional family, but tonight, listening to the quiet conversations and gentle laughter around their campfire, Sam felt something he hadn't experienced in months: optimism about the future. The storm struck on their 5th day out from Great Falls, transforming the Montana landscape from a picture of autumn beauty into a howling nightmare of wind, rain, and early snow that tested every preparation they had made and revealed weaknesses in their planning that could have proven fatal. Sam woke before dawn to the sound of canvas snapping violently in gusting wind that seemed to come from all directions at once. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees during the night, and what had begun as gentle rain was now a mixture of sleet and wet snow that turned the wagon road into a treacherous ribbon of mud and ice. "Mr. Harrison," Martha's voice cut through the storm's roar as she emerged from the children's shelter, her hair whipping around her face and her clothes already soaked despite the brief exposure. "We need to make some decisions quickly. The creek beside our camp is rising fast, and the road ahead is washing out." Sam struggled into his coat and boots, his mind immediately shifting into crisis management mode. Mountain storms could be deadly for unprepared travelers, and their small group was still learning to function as a unit under normal conditions. Facing their first serious emergency would test not only their practical preparations, but also their ability to work together when lives might depend on quick, coordinated action. The scene outside their shelters confirmed Martha's assessment. The cheerful mountain stream where they had filled their water barrels the previous evening had become a roaring torrent that was rapidly eroding its banks and threatening to flood the low ground where they had positioned their wagon. Worse, the road they needed to follow south had become a river of mud that would be impassable for their heavy freight wagon until the storm passed and the ground dried. David Sheen emerged from the children's shelter carrying his notebook, its pages protected by an oilcloth wrapper that demonstrated his understanding of the importance of preserving essential information even in crisis situations. Despite the freezing rain and howling wind, David had been calculating their options with the methodical precision that characterized his approach to every problem. "Mr. Harrison," David called out, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "We have 3 choices, and none of them are particularly good. We can try to move the wagon to higher ground and wait out the storm. We can attempt to continue south on the muddy road and risk getting stuck. Or we can backtrack to the last town and find shelter until conditions improve." Sam felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. These 5 children were depending on his judgment to keep them safe. But his experience with mountain storms was limited to situations where he could take shelter in substantial buildings rather than canvas shelters that provided minimal protection from the elements. "What do you think we should do?" Sam asked, recognizing that the children's recent travel experience might provide insights his ranching background couldn't offer. Robert Hayes had been studying the terrain around their camp, and now he approached with observations that reflected his analytical approach to environmental assessment. "The high ground to our west looks stable, but moving the wagon there would require crossing the creek before it rises further. If we wait much longer, that option disappears." Lucy Chun had been monitoring their supplies and equipment, her practical nature driving her to assess how their preparations were holding up under actual storm conditions. "Our food is secure and our medical supplies are dry," she reported. "But the canvas over the wagon is leaking in 2 places, and some of our bedding is getting wet." James Peterson, despite his physical limitations, had positioned himself where he could observe the storm's development while remaining relatively protected from the worst weather. His artistic eye, trained to notice details others might miss, had identified patterns that could affect their decision-making. "Mr. Harrison," James called out, pointing toward the western sky where the cloud formation showed subtle changes. "I think this storm might be breaking up faster than it appeared initially. The wind is shifting direction, and the snow is turning back to rain." Sam studied the sky, trying to read weather signs with eyes trained for Montana's high plains rather than mountain conditions. The children's observations were providing information he might have missed, and their collective analysis was revealing options and risks he hadn't initially considered. "Here's what we're going to do," Sam decided, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to make decisions quickly when circumstances demanded action. "David and Robert, help me move the horses to higher ground. Martha and Lucy, secure our supplies and prepare for wagon movement. James, keep watching the weather and let us know if conditions change significantly." The next 2 hours tested every aspect of their preparation and teamwork. Moving their heavy freight wagon across a swollen creek while maintaining control of 4 nervous horses required coordination and communication that pushed their still developing group dynamics to the breaking point. Martha proved invaluable as a coordinator, positioning herself where she could relay information between team members and ensure that everyone understood their roles in the complex operation. Her experience managing younger children during their journey west had prepared her for situations where clear communication could prevent accidents or confusion. David's mathematical precision became crucial when calculating the angles and leverage needed to guide their wagon across uneven terrain without damaging axles or wheels. His ability to estimate weights and forces helped them avoid mistakes that could have left them stranded with a broken vehicle hundreds of miles from professional repair services. Robert's analytical assessment of the terrain proved accurate, as the route he had identified to higher ground turned out to be both passable and stable, enough to support their heavily loaded wagon. His careful observation had prevented them from attempting shortcuts that might have led to disaster. Lucy's management of their supplies ensured that nothing essential was lost during the emergency relocation, while her practical approach to problem-solving helped them reorganize their equipment in ways that better accommodated the cramped conditions of storm shelter. James, despite being unable to participate in the heavy physical labor, provided crucial information about changing weather conditions and served as an early warning system for potential hazards. His artistic documentation of the crisis would later prove valuable for understanding what had worked and what needed improvement in their emergency procedures. By mid-morning, they had successfully moved to higher ground and established a more secure camp that could withstand the continuing storm. But the crisis had revealed both strengths and weaknesses in their group dynamics that needed to be addressed before they faced their next challenge. As they huddled around a small fire built inside a makeshift windbreak, Sam realized that the Storm had accelerated their development as a functioning team by forcing them to rely on each other's skills and judgment under pressure. The children had responded to the emergency with maturity and competence that impressed him, but he had also seen moments of fear and uncertainty that reminded him of their ages and vulnerabilities. "How did we do?" Sam asked, genuinely interested. In their assessment of the morning's crisis management, Martha considered the question with her characteristic directness. "We worked well together, but we made some mistakes that could have been dangerous. We didn't have clear procedures for who was responsible for what during an emergency, and we wasted time figuring out roles while the situation was getting worse." David nodded agreement while consulting his notebook, where he had been recording lessons learned from their first serious test. "We also didn't have adequate backup plans if our primary strategy had failed. What would we have done if the creek had risen too fast for us to cross safely?" Robert's analysis focused on their decision-making process. "We gathered information quickly and made reasonable choices based on what we knew, but we didn't have enough experience with mountain weather to anticipate how rapidly conditions could change." Lucy's concerns were more practical and immediate. "Some of our equipment wasn't properly prepared for this kind of weather. We need better waterproofing for our supplies and more secure methods for protecting our food and medical supplies." James had been sketching during their conversation, his artistic abilities allowing him to create visual records that supplemented their verbal analysis. "I think we should document what we learned today so we can do better next time. This won't be our last storm, and next time we might not be so lucky." Sam felt a complex mixture of pride and concern as he listened to their assessment. These children were analyzing their crisis response with the sophistication of experienced travelers, identifying weaknesses and developing improvements with remarkable maturity. But their casual acceptance of future dangers reminded him that they had learned to expect hardship as a normal part of life. "What would have happened to you if you had been traveling with a different kind of guardian?" Sam asked, curious about their perspective on alternative scenarios. Martha's expression grew somber as she considered the question. "Most adults would have panicked or made decisions without asking our opinions. We probably would have ended up stuck in the mud or trying to shelter in an unsafe location because someone with more authority than experience insisted on doing things their way." David's assessment was characteristically analytical. Adults often assume that being older automatically makes their judgment better, but experience matters more than age when you're dealing with specific types of problems. "We've been traveling in difficult conditions for months, while many adults have never faced anything like this." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses and voices carrying through the diminishing storm. Sam looked up to see 3 riders approaching their camp, their heavy coats and experienced movements identifying them as local ranchers or guides, familiar with mountain travel. The lead rider was a woman in her 40s with the weathered face and confident bearing of someone who had spent decades working in challenging conditions. She dismounted near their fire and approached with the careful politeness that characterized interactions between strangers in frontier situations. "Folks, I'm Catherine Brennan from the Triple B Ranch about 10 miles south of here," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in emergency situations. "We saw your smoke and wanted to check if you needed assistance." This storm caught a lot of travelers unprepared. Sam rose to greet their unexpected visitors, conscious that his group's appearance might raise questions about their unusual composition. A single man traveling with 5 children of varying ages and ethnicities was sufficiently uncommon to attract attention and potentially unwelcome scrutiny. "I'm Samuel Harrison," Sam replied, "and these are my children. We're heading to Colorado to establish a ranch. The storm forced us to relocate our camp, but we're managing well enough." Catherine's experienced eyes quickly assessed their camp setup, taking in the secure positioning of their wagon, the organization of their supplies, and the apparent competence of their storm preparations. Her expression shifted from concern to curiosity as she recognized that this group was better prepared than many experienced travelers she had encountered. "Your children seem to know what they're doing," Catherine observed, her tone suggesting both surprise and respect. "Most folks we rescue from storms haven't had the sense to move to high ground before the creek rose." Martha stepped forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to speaking for her group. "We've learned that preparation and quick decision-making are important when you're traveling in unfamiliar territory. Mr. Harrison asked our opinions about how to handle the emergency, and we worked together to find the safest option." Catherine's eyebrows rose at Martha's articulate response and obvious leadership abilities. "How old are you, miss?" 14, ma'am," Martha replied. "But I've been responsible for helping manage our group during several months of travel. Age doesn't always determine who has the most relevant experience for specific situations." Sam watched Catherine's reaction to Martha's confident response, recognizing that their unconventional family structure was being evaluated by someone whose opinion might matter for their future success in the region. The children's competence during the storm had impressed him, but would their abilities be recognized and respected by the established ranching community they hoped to join? Catherine's assessment proved more positive than Sam had dared hope. "Well, you folks seem to have things well in hand," she said with genuine respect. "If you're planning to establish operations in Colorado, you might want to consider stopping at our ranch before you cross the border. My husband knows the territory down there, and he might have information that could help you make better decisions about where to settle." The offer represented the first indication that their group might be accepted by the broader community of ranchers and settlers whose cooperation would be essential for long-term success. But as Catherine and her companions rode away, Sam realized that the storm had been more than just a test of their emergency preparedness. It had been their first real demonstration that the unconventional family he was trying to build might actually work under pressure, that the children's experiences and abilities could complement his own knowledge in ways that made their entire group stronger and more capable than any of them would have been individually. The storm was breaking, and patches of blue sky were beginning to appear between the racing clouds. Tomorrow they would continue their journey toward Colorado, but today had proven that they might actually be capable of building something extraordinary together. The San Luis Valley spread before them like a vast green carpet bordered by snow-capped peaks that reached toward a sky so intensely blue it seemed painted by an artist's brush. After 2 weeks of mountain roads, river crossings, and the constant uncertainty of frontier travel, the sight of their destination struck Sam and his 5 charges with the force of a revelation. This was Colorado territory at its most magnificent. A high mountain valley 8,000 feet above sea level, where the Rio Grande wound through meadows so lush they seemed to promise prosperity to anyone bold enough to claim them. The morning air was thin and crystalline, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers, along with something else that took Sam a moment to identify: possibility. "Sweet Mother of God," Martha whispered, her Irish accent thickening with emotion as she stood beside their wagon and surveyed the landscape that would become their new home. "It's like someone took the best parts of Ireland and made them bigger and wilder." David Chun had been consulting his notebook and the rough maps they had acquired during their journey, but now he looked up with an expression of wonder that made him appear younger than his 10 years. "Mr. Harrison, the valley must be 40 miles across. There's enough good land here to support hundreds of families." Robert Hayes was studying the distant mountains with the analytical attention he brought to every new environment. "The elevation explains why the growing season is shorter than in Montana, but the soil looks rich and the water sources appear reliable. This could actually work." Lucy Chun had been quiet during their final approach to the valley, but now she spoke with the careful precision that characterized her observations. "The light is different here, cleaner somehow. I think this might be a good place for learning." James Peterson, despite his physical limitations, had insisted on walking the final mile into the valley to better appreciate their destination. Now he stood leaning against a boulder, his artistic eye capturing details that others might miss. The colors change every few minutes as the clouds move across the mountains. I could spend years trying to draw all the different ways this place looks. Sam felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion as he absorbed both the natural beauty before them and the children's responses to their new home. For months, the Colorado ranch had existed only as an abstract concept, a desperate gamble, by a man who had lost everything and was trying to rebuild from nothing. But standing here with 5 remarkable young people who had chosen to trust their futures to his uncertain leadership, the dream suddenly felt achievable. The town of Alamosa lay 10 miles to the east, a collection of buildings clustered around the railroad depot that connected the isolated valley to the broader world of commerce and communication. But their immediate destination was the land office, where Sam hoped to claim the homestead that would serve as the foundation for everything they planned to build. The government's land grant program for educational and agricultural institutions was designed to encourage settlement in developing territories by offering substantial acreage to anyone willing to establish operations that serve the broader community. Sam's proposal, an agricultural training center that would teach practical skills to orphaned and displaced children, had been approved based on written applications and letters of recommendation. But converting bureaucratic approval into actual ownership would require navigating procedures he didn't fully understand. "Mr. Harrison," Martha said, her practical nature driving her to address immediate concerns while they stood admiring distant vistas, "we should probably find out exactly where our land is located before we get too attached to any particular views." Sam nodded, recognizing that Martha's suggestion reflected the kind of practical thinking that had kept their group functioning effectively throughout their journey. The emotional impact of reaching their destination was powerful, but they still had substantial work ahead of them before they could claim any permanent connection to this place. The ride into Alamosa revealed a community in the midst of rapid transformation. The railroad's arrival had brought an influx of settlers, merchants, and opportunists who were establishing businesses and services to support the valley's growing population. New buildings rose beside established structures, creating a mixture of architectural styles that reflected the diverse origins of the territory's recent arrivals. The land office occupied a modest building on Main Street, its windows lined with maps and legal notices that advertised available homesteads and government programs. Inside, a harried clerk named William Foster presided over filing cabinets stuffed with documents while managing a steady stream of settlers seeking information about land claims, water rights, and territorial regulations. "Mr. Harrison?" Foster inquired when Sam presented his paperwork. "The Harrison Agricultural Training Institute." "Yes, I have your file here. Congratulations, your application for the Section 16 grant has been approved." Sam felt a surge of relief at the confirmation, but Foster's next words introduced complications he hadn't anticipated. "However," Foster continued, consulting a thick folder of documents, "there have been some developments since your initial application was filed. Another party has expressed interest in adjacent land for a similar educational purpose, and the territorial government wants to ensure that competing institutions don't duplicate services or create unnecessary conflicts." "What kind of competing institution?" Sam asked, though he suspected the answer would involve challenges to their plans that went beyond simple administrative complications. Foster withdrew a letter bearing official territorial letterhead and began reading from formal language that carried ominous implications. "The Colorado Territorial Board of Education has received an application from the Mountain Valley Industrial School, proposed by Marcus Thornfield of Denver, for establishment of a facility designed to train orphan children in industrial and domestic skills appropriate to their station in life." Sam felt his stomach drop as he absorbed the implications of Foster's statement. The phrase appropriate to their station in life was bureaucratic language for an institution designed to train orphaned children as servants and laborers rather than independent citizens capable of determining their own futures. What exactly does that mean for our application? Sam asked, though he suspected the answer would involve delays and complications that could undermine everything they had worked toward. It means, Foster replied with obvious discomfort, that the territorial board wants to review both proposals before making final land allocations. They've scheduled a hearing for next week where both parties can present their plans and demonstrate their qualifications for receiving government support. Martha stepped forward with the confidence that had served her well throughout their journey. Mr. Foster, what criteria will the board use to evaluate the competing proposals? Foster consulted another document before answering. Financial resources, educational qualifications of the proposed staff, detailed curriculum plans, and demonstrated community support. The board wants to ensure that any institution receiving government land grants will provide genuine educational opportunities rather than simply exploiting children for their labor value. David Chun had been listening intently while making notes in his ever-present notebook. Now he asked the kind of practical question that characterized his approach to every situation. How much time do we have to prepare our presentation, and what kind of documentation will the board expect to see? 1 week, Foster replied. And they'll want detailed budgets, curriculum outlines, staff qualifications, and letters of support from community members who can vouch for your character and capabilities. Sam felt the weight of the challenge settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. Marcus Thornfield, whoever he was, undoubtedly possessed financial resources and political connections that far exceeded anything Sam could bring to bear. Competing against an established Denver businessman for territorial support would require more than good intentions and the children's remarkable abilities. Mr. Foster, Robert Hayes said, with the careful precision that characterized his communications, would it be possible to review Mr. Thornfield's proposal so we understand exactly what we're competing against? Foster shook his head. Proposals are confidential until the public hearing. But I can tell you that Mr. Thornfield has substantial backing from Denver business interests and has hired experienced educators to design his curriculum. As they left the land office, Sam felt the enthusiasm of their arrival in Colorado being replaced by anxiety about challenges he hadn't anticipated. The children, however, seemed to view the competition as an interesting problem to be solved rather than an insurmountable obstacle. This could actually work in our favor, Martha observed as they established camp outside Alamosa while planning their next steps. If we can demonstrate that our approach produces better results than traditional institutional methods, we might gain support from people who care more about outcomes than credentials. David was already analyzing their competitive position with characteristic mathematical precision. Mr. Thornfield has financial advantages, but we have something he probably doesn't have: actual experience working together as a team and proven results from our collaboration. Robert's assessment focused on strategic considerations. We need to understand what the community wants from an educational institution and show how our approach serves those needs better than a traditional industrial school. Lucy had been considering their situation from a different angle. Maybe we should talk to local families who have children. They might have opinions about what kind of education would actually help their children succeed. James had been sketching while listening to their discussion, his artistic abilities allowing him to process information through visual representation. What if we could show the board exactly what our educational approach looks like instead of just describing it? Demonstrations are more convincing than documents. Sam realized that the children were approaching their first major business challenge with the same collaborative problem-solving that had served them well during their journey. Their suggestions revealed strategic thinking that complemented his own experience while addressing weaknesses in his background that could have undermined their chances. Over the following days, they threw themselves into preparation with an intensity that impressed even Sam. Martha organized their research efforts and managed their documentation with military precision. David calculated budgets and financial projections that demonstrated their proposed operations' economic viability. Robert studied territorial education policy and identified key arguments that would resonate with board members. Lucy interviewed local families to understand community needs and priorities, while James created visual materials that illustrated their educational philosophy and demonstrated the children's actual capabilities. Each member of their group contributed specialized skills while working toward their common goal. The breakthrough came when Lucy returned from a conversation with Maria Santos, a local rancher's wife whose own children had limited educational opportunities due to the valley's isolation from established schools. Mrs. Santos says the biggest problem here isn't that children don't want to learn, Lucy reported. It's that most education programs are designed for cities and don't teach skills that actually help families succeed in frontier conditions. Martha immediately grasped the implications of Lucy's discovery. So if we can show that our approach teaches practical skills alongside traditional subjects, we might appeal to families who feel ignored by conventional educational institutions. David's analysis confirmed the strategic opportunity Lucy had identified. The territorial board probably hears a lot of proposals for institutions that serve bureaucratic requirements without addressing real community needs. If we can demonstrate genuine local support based on practical benefits that might outweigh Mr. Thornfield's financial advantages. Sam felt hope rekindling as he watched his charges develop strategies that transformed their apparent disadvantages into competitive strengths. They were right that their collaborative approach and proven results gave them something most conventional educational proposals couldn't offer, evidence that their methods actually worked. The week of preparation revealed capabilities in each child that even Sam hadn't fully appreciated. Martha's organizational skills rivaled those of experienced administrators. David's financial analysis demonstrated sophistication that impressed local businessmen who reviewed their projections. Robert's policy research identified legal arguments that strengthened their position. Lucy's community outreach had generated letters of support from families throughout the valley who were excited about educational opportunities that combined academic learning with practical skills. James's artistic documentation provided visual evidence of their group's achievements and potential. As the day of the territorial board hearing approached, Sam realized that his 5 remarkable charges had transformed from children he was trying to help into partners who were helping him achieve something extraordinary. Their collaboration had evolved beyond his original vision of an agricultural training center into something that could genuinely serve the broader community while providing opportunities that none of them could have achieved individually. Colorado Dream was taking shape, but its final form would be determined by their ability to convince government officials that unconventional approaches could produce exceptional results. Everything they had worked toward would be decided in a single presentation to strangers who held their future in their hands. But for the first time since leaving Montana, Sam felt confident that they were ready for whatever challenges awaited them. The territorial courthouse in Alamosa had never hosted a hearing quite like this one. By 8 o'clock on the morning of October 30th, 1889, the building's main chamber was packed with an audience that included local ranchers, territorial officials, newspaper correspondents, and curious townspeople who had heard rumors about the unusual competition for government land grants. Sam Harrison sat at a worn wooden table with his 5 charges, their carefully prepared materials arranged with the precision Martha had insisted upon. Across the room, Marcus Thornfield commanded a much larger table surrounded by assistants, lawyers, and impressive-looking documents bound in leather portfolios that spoke of serious financial backing. Thornfield himself was everything Sam had expected, a prosperous Denver businessman in his 50s, with silver hair, expensive clothes, and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through a combination of money and political influence. His proposal for the Mountain Valley Industrial School came with endorsements from territorial legislators, banking officials, and prominent businessmen who viewed child welfare as an opportunity for profitable investment. "Gentlemen, ladies," announced Territorial Education Superintendent James Morrison, a thin man with scholarly spectacles who clearly felt uncomfortable with the attention this hearing had attracted. "We are here to evaluate competing proposals for educational land grants in the San Luis Valley. Each party will have 30 minutes to present their plans, followed by questions from the review board." Morrison gestured toward a panel of 5 officials who would determine the fate of Sam's dreams and the children's futures. They included the Territorial Land Commissioner, a representative from the Federal Education Office, 2 local business leaders, and surprisingly, Catherine Brennan, the experienced rancher who had encountered them during their storm crisis weeks earlier. "Mr. Thornfield," Morrison continued, "as the party with priority filing, you may present first." Thornfield rose with theatrical confidence, his presentation polished by years of experience convincing investors and politicians to support his various business ventures. For 25 minutes, he outlined his vision for an industrial training facility that would process orphan children through standardized curricula designed to produce reliable workers for Colorado's developing economy. The Mountain Valley Industrial School will provide disciplined instruction in domestic arts for girls and manual trades for boys, Thornfield declared, consulting notes prepared by his educational consultants. Children will learn obedience, punctuality, and basic skills appropriate to their social position while contributing to the institution's economic sustainability through productive labor. Sam felt his stomach tighten as he listened to Thornfield's clinical description of children as raw materials to be processed into useful products. The proposal was professionally presented and financially sound, but it treated the students as economic units rather than human beings with individual potential and dignity. Thornfield's financial projections impressed the board members, as did his political connections and detailed operational plans. His institution would be profitable within 3 years, provide reliable workers for territorial development, and operate according to established educational models that had been tested in other locations. "Thank you, Mr. Thornfield," Morrison said when the presentation concluded. "Mr. Harrison, you may now present your proposal." Sam rose on unsteady legs, conscious that everything he and the children had worked toward would be determined by the next 30 minutes. But as he looked around the packed courtroom, he realized that this hearing represented something larger than a simple competition for land grants. It was a test of whether society would choose efficiency over humanity, conformity over innovation, control over freedom. "Members of the board, friends and neighbors," Sam began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "3 months ago, I was a failed rancher with nothing to offer anyone. Today, I stand before you with 5 remarkable young people who have taught me that the most important education happens when children are treated as partners in their own learning rather than products to be manufactured." Sam gestured toward his charges who had arranged themselves strategically around the room to demonstrate their presentation. "Instead of describing our educational philosophy, we would like to show you what it looks like in practice." Martha stepped forward first, her 14-year-old confidence commanding immediate attention from the assembled crowd. "My name is Martha Sullivan, and 3 months ago I was an orphan with no prospects beyond domestic servitude. Today, I can present a financial analysis of our proposed operation that demonstrates economic sustainability while prioritizing student welfare over profit margins." She moved to a large chart David had prepared, explaining their budget projections and revenue models with the sophistication of an experienced accountant. Her analysis showed how their collaborative approach could generate income through agricultural products, educational services, and community partnerships while maintaining focus on student development rather than institutional profit. David Chun followed, his presentation demonstrating mathematical and analytical abilities that impressed even the skeptical board members. Traditional industrial schools produce standardized workers for predetermined roles. David explained, his accent barely detectable after months of careful practice. Our approach develops individual capabilities that allow students to create their own opportunities rather than simply filling positions others have defined for them. Robert Hayes presented their community research, showing how local families had expressed support for educational programs that addressed regional needs, rather than imposing external standards. His data demonstrated that conventional institutions often failed in frontier conditions because they ignored local realities in favor of bureaucratic requirements. Lucy Chun's presentation focused on curriculum innovation, describing educational methods that combined traditional subjects with practical skills while encouraging creative thinking and problem-solving. Her examples showed how academic learning became more meaningful when connected to real-world applications that students could use immediately. James Peterson's artistic documentation provided visual evidence of their collaborative achievements, showing the progression from 5 desperate children and 1 failed rancher to a functioning team, capable of complex planning and execution. His drawings and maps illustrated their journey while demonstrating capabilities that traditional educational assessment would never have identified. But it was the children's collective demonstration that truly captured the audience's attention. Working together with practiced efficiency, they showed how their collaborative learning model functioned in practice. Martha coordinated while David calculated, Robert analyzed while Lucy researched, and James documented while everyone contributed to solutions that exceeded what any individual could have achieved alone. This is what education looks like when children are respected as thinking human beings, rather than empty vessels to be filled with predetermined knowledge. Sam concluded, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. These young people didn't just survive their circumstances, they transformed them into strengths that will serve them throughout their lives. The question period that followed revealed the fundamental difference between the two approaches. Board members asked Thornfield about efficiency, standardization, and profit margins. They asked Sam about innovation, individual development, and community impact. Thornfield's answers emphasized control, predictability, and economic return on investment. Sam's responses focused on human potential, creative problem-solving, and social responsibility. The contrast couldn't have been clearer. One approach treated children as manufacturing problems, the other as human possibilities. Catherine Brennan's questions proved particularly revealing. As someone who had witnessed their group's competence during the storm crisis, she understood what their collaborative approach could achieve under pressure. Mr. Harrison, Brennan asked, how do you respond to concerns that your students might be unprepared for the discipline and structure required in conventional employment situations? Martha answered before Sam could respond, her Irish directness cutting through diplomatic evasion. Mrs. Brennan, we've learned more about discipline and structure during 3 months of building something together than we learned during years of having structure imposed on us by adults who were more concerned with compliance than competence. David supported Martha's point with characteristic precision. Traditional industrial schools teach children to follow orders without thinking. Our approach teaches us to think clearly so we can give ourselves the right orders. The hearing concluded with closing statements that crystallized the choice facing the territorial board. Thornfield offered proven methods, financial security, and institutional respectability. Sam offered innovation, human development, and community partnership. The Mountain Valley Industrial School represents established educational practice. Thornfield concluded, while Mr. Harrison's proposal is an untested experiment, that risks valuable public resources on unproven theories. Sam's closing was simpler and more direct. Members of the board, you have a choice between treating children as problems to be managed or as human beings, capable of extraordinary achievements when given proper support and respect. I believe Colorado's future depends on choosing humanity over efficiency. The board's deliberation lasted 2 hours while the courtroom audience waited in tense silence. When they finally returned, Superintendent Morrison's expression was unreadable as he prepared to announce their decision. After careful consideration of both proposals, Morrison began, his voice carrying across the packed chamber. The Territorial Education Board has decided to award the Section 16 land grant to the Harrison Agricultural Training Institute. The courtroom erupted in applause and celebration as Sam felt his knees buckle with relief. But Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, Morrison continued, the board has voted to designate the Harrison Institute as a pilot program for innovative educational methods, with additional funding available if initial results justify expansion to other territorial locations. Sam looked at his 5 charges, seeing in their faces the same mixture of joy, relief, and determination that he felt himself. They had won more than a land grant. They had proven that unconventional approaches could succeed when built on mutual respect and collaborative effort. Thornfield approached their table as the crowd began to disperse, his expression more curious than hostile. Mr. Harrison, I admit I underestimated your presentation. Your students are remarkably capable. They're not my students, Mr. Thornfield, Sam replied. They're my partners. That's what made the difference. 5 years later, the Harrison Agricultural Training Institute had grown from a desperate gamble into a model that was being studied and replicated across the American West. The original log buildings had been expanded into a complex of classrooms, workshops, dormitories, and agricultural facilities that served 96 students from across the territorial region. Martha Sullivan, now 19, served as the Institute's business manager while pursuing correspondence courses in advanced mathematics and economics. Her organizational skills had proven invaluable as their operation expanded beyond Sam's original vision. David Chun had become the Institute's mathematics and engineering instructor, while developing innovations in agricultural equipment that were being manufactured and sold throughout Colorado. His analytical abilities, once seen as threatening by prejudiced adults, were now recognized as valuable contributions to territorial development. Robert Hayes managed the Institute's research programs, documenting educational methods and outcomes for publication in national journals that were carrying news of their success to educators across the country. His careful analysis had provided the evidence needed to convince skeptics that their approach produced measurable results. Lucy Chun directed the Institute's elementary education programs while training other teachers in collaborative learning methods. Her understanding of how to help children from diverse backgrounds succeed had become the foundation for curriculum innovations that were being adopted by conventional schools. James Peterson had established the Institute's art and documentation programs while pursuing his own artistic development through correspondence with established painters and sculptors. His visual records of their growth and achievements had become historical documents that preserved their story for future generations. Sam Harrison, now 39 and graying at the temples, served as the Institute's director while continuing to learn from the remarkable young people who had transformed his life. The failed rancher had become a respected educator, but more importantly, he had become part of a family that had chosen each other and built something extraordinary together. The San Luis Valley stretched around their expanded facilities, its beauty unchanged, but its human potential dramatically enhanced by an institution that had proven children could achieve remarkable things when treated with respect, challenged with meaningful work, and supported with unwavering belief in their capabilities. The 5 orphans Sam had bought at auction had indeed made history, not as products of someone else's vision, but as architects of their own futures and creators of opportunities for countless children who would follow in their footsteps. Their success had demonstrated that the most powerful education emerged from collaboration, respect, and the revolutionary idea that children were human beings worthy of dignity rather than raw materials to be processed into useful products. The Harrison Agricultural Training Institute stood as proof that desperate circumstances could become the foundation for extraordinary achievements when courage, compassion, and collaboration transformed individual survival into collective success. And in the mountains of Colorado, 5 remarkable young people continued learning, teaching, and building the future they had dared to imagine possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.